3 times a day. What the Black American did to Japanese POWs changed the entire history. August 23, 1945. Guam, Mariana Islands. The transport ship's engines died with a shudder that sent 87 Japanese prisoners of war stumbling forward in their chains. Through the rusted hull, Sergeant Ishiro Tanaka could hear American voices shouting orders in a language that sounded like barking dogs. He closed his eyes and prepared for what he knew was coming. The beatings, the starvation, the humiliation his officers had warned about since the war began. What none of these men knew, standing in the suffocating darkness of that cargo hold, was that they were about to encounter something that would shatter every belief the Imperial Japanese Army had drilled into their minds. Within hours, their understanding of their enemy, their war, and themselves would begin a transformation that historians would later call one of the most remarkable psychological shifts in modern military history. The hatch opened. Blinding Pacific sunlight flooded the hold. Tanaka squinted against the glare as American soldiers appeared at the opening, their rifles ready. The Japanese prisoners shuffled forward in a line, their legs weak from the 3-day voyage in cramped conditions. Many hadn't eaten in 2 days. Several were wounded, their injuries wrapped in filthy bandages that hadn't been changed since their capture on Okinawa. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now, back to the story. Camp 7 sat 2 miles inland from the harbor, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The prisoners marched in silence, expecting at any moment to feel rifle butts against their backs. Instead, the American guards walked alongside them without violence. This alone confused Tanaka. Where was the brutality they'd been promised? At the camp entrance stood a black American sergeant whose name tag read Robinson. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could crush coconuts. But his eyes held something Tanaka didn't expect. Not hatred, not anger, something else entirely. "They need water," Robinson said to the guard commander. His voice was steady, calm. "Look at them. They're about to collapse." "They're prisoners, Sergeant," the commander replied. "They get processed first." "They're human beings first," Robinson said. "They get water first." What happened next would become the subject of testimony in post-war interviews conducted by the United States Army Historical Division. Robinson walked to the mess hall and returned carrying a bucket of water and a ladle. He approached the first prisoner, a young man barely 20 years old whose lips were cracked and bleeding. Robinson held the ladle to his mouth. The young prisoner, Private Kenji Matsuda, would later recall in a 1953 interview, "Thought it was a trick. I thought he would pull it away or that the water was poisoned. But he just stood there, waiting. When I drank, the water was cool and clean. He waited until I finished, then moved to the next man. I watched his face. There was no mockery there, no cruelty, just patience." Tanaka watched from his place in line as Robinson moved methodically down the row. Every prisoner received water. Not a sip, but as much as they could drink. When Robinson reached Tanaka, their eyes met. In that moment, the Japanese sergeant saw something that contradicted 4 years of propaganda. He saw compassion from a man whose people, he'd been taught, were themselves oppressed and inferior. "Drink," Robinson said in broken Japanese. "You're safe now." Those 3 words, delivered by a black American soldier to a Japanese prisoner of war on a remote Pacific island, would echo through the decades that followed. They marked the beginning of what military psychologists would later document as the most successful prisoner rehabilitation program of World War II. The transformation had begun with a ladle of water. August 24, 1945. 5:30 in the morning. The mess hall at Camp 7 measured 40 feet by 60 feet, with wooden tables arranged in rows that could seat 200 men. When the Japanese prisoners entered for their first meal, they shuffled in expecting the worst. In training camps across Japan, soldiers had been told that American prison camps served rotten food, spoiled rice, and water contaminated with disease. Some prisoners believed they were being led to their execution. Instead, they found Sergeant Charlie Robinson standing behind a serving line, a clean white apron tied over his uniform. Steam rose from metal trays filled with food that made several prisoners stop in their tracks. Rice. Real rice, white and properly cooked, not the moldy scraps they'd eaten during the final months of fighting. Alongside it sat canned vegetables, corned beef, and fresh bread that filled the hall with a smell none of them had experienced in over a year. "Form a line," Robinson said through an interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier from Hawaii named Kenneth Yamamoto. "Everyone eats. Everyone gets the same portion." The prisoners hesitated. This had to be psychological warfare, some twisted American trick. Tanaka studied Robinson's face for signs of deception. He found none. Slowly, the first prisoner approached the serving line. Robinson personally placed food on his tray: a full cup of rice, 2 pieces of bread, vegetables, meat. The portion exceeded what Japanese soldiers had received even before the war turned desperate. Private Matsuda, standing third in line, would later testify, "I kept waiting for someone to laugh at us or knock the food from our hands. In the Imperial Army, prisoners were less than dogs. They deserved nothing but contempt. Yet this American sergeant, this black man we'd been taught was barely human himself, was serving us food with his own hands. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming." When a prisoner near the middle of the line, Corporal Hiroshi Yamada, stumbled due to an infected leg wound, Robinson stepped around the serving table. He helped Yamada to a seat, then brought him his food. The wounded man stared at his tray, then at Robinson, then back at his tray. Tears began running down his face. "Why?" Yamada asked in broken English, the only English word he knew. "Why?" Robinson understood the question even if Yamada couldn't articulate the full depth of what he was asking. Why kindness to enemies? Why mercy to those who'd tried to kill Americans? Why humanity to men who'd been taught Americans had none? "Because the war is over," Robinson said through Yamamoto, "and because you're human beings who need to eat." The breakfast continued in near silence. Tanaka ate slowly, each bite confirming that the food was real, unspoiled, abundant. He watched Robinson move through the mess hall, checking on prisoners, offering seconds to those who'd finished their portions, helping an elderly soldier whose hands shook too badly to hold his chopsticks. The American sergeant's actions contradicted everything Tanaka had learned in 20 years of military indoctrination. Master Sergeant James Crawford, the white officer overseeing the camp, filed a report that day that now resides in the National Archives. Sergeant Robinson has established an unprecedented rapport with the Japanese prisoners. His consistent displays of dignity and respect have produced a noticeable calming effect on men who arrived expecting execution. Recommend continuation of current protocols. But something else happened that morning that would prove more significant than full stomachs. As prisoners finished eating, Robinson stood at the door, thanking each one as they left. In Japanese, learned phonetically from Yamamoto, he repeated the same phrase. "Thank you for eating. You'll be fed again at noon." 3 times that day, Robinson served food to men who'd been his enemies. 3 times, he treated them with dignity. 3 times, he demonstrated that mercy could be more powerful than revenge. The prisoners returned to their barracks confused, frightened by their confusion, and unable to reconcile what they'd experienced with what they'd been taught to expect. In that confusion lay the seeds of transformation. August 27th, 1945. The morning sun beat down on Camp 7 with the relentless intensity that made the Pacific Theater legendary for breaking men's spirits. In Barracks C, Sergeant Tanaka sat on his bunk and watched through the window as Sergeant Robinson made his daily rounds. For 5 days now, the pattern had remained constant. 3 meals daily, clean water available throughout the day, medical attention for the wounded, and most disturbing of all, consistent kindness from a man who had every reason to hate them. The transformation was already beginning, though Tanaka fought against it with every fiber of his being. 2 prisoners had started volunteering for work details, something previously unthinkable. Private Matsuda had asked Yamamoto to teach him English phrases. Even Corporal Yamada, whose leg wound had required surgery by the camp doctor, spoke openly about the American medical care that had likely saved his life. "They're trying to make us weak," Tanaka told his men that afternoon, though his words carried less conviction than they had 3 days earlier. "This kindness is a weapon. They want us to forget who we are." But forgetting was already happening. Not through force, but through the quiet accumulation of small mercies. At lunch, Robinson noticed that Private Yoshiro Sato, a man barely 19 years old, had lost significant weight even in the 5 days since arrival. Malnutrition from the final months of combat had left him gaunt, his ribs visible through his shirt. Robinson doubled his portion without being asked. When Sato protested, Robinson simply shook his head. "You need it more," Robinson said through Yamamoto. "Eat." That afternoon, Robinson organized a distribution of clean clothing. The prisoners had been wearing the same tattered uniforms since capture, many stained with blood and caked with mud from Okinawa's hills. American work clothes, simple but clean, were handed out to every man. Tanaka accepted his bundle and felt the fabric. It was worn but freshly laundered, smelling of soap rather than death. In the medical barracks, Robinson spent an hour assisting Dr. Margaret Chen, a Chinese-American physician from San Francisco, as she treated infected wounds and tropical diseases. He held instruments, translated through Yamamoto, and physically supported prisoners too weak to stand during examinations. When Private Kazuo Nakamura, suffering from dysentery, soiled himself during examination, Robinson cleaned him without comment or disgust, then helped him to a clean bed. Nakamura would write in a 1968 memoir published in Tokyo, "I had lost all dignity. I was prepared to die. But this American, this black soldier, he treated me as if I were his own brother. He changed my clothes, cleaned the floor, and never once showed contempt. In the Imperial Army, I would have been beaten for such weakness. Here, I was treated with compassion I didn't deserve." That moment broke something inside me. The hatred I'd carried for 4 years began to crack. The breaking was happening to others too. That evening, during dinner, Robinson made small talk as he served. He asked about families through Yamamoto, about hometowns, about simple human details that acknowledged prisoners as individuals rather than enemy combatants. Some refused to answer, maintaining their wall of resistance. Others, tired of fighting and confused by kindness, responded with brief answers that became the first real conversations between captor and captive. Tanaka observed it, all with growing alarm. He recognized psychological warfare when he saw it, even if the tactics were unfamiliar. Make the enemy comfortable, lower their guard, then extract information or cooperation. It had to be a strategy. The alternative was too disturbing to consider. That Americans, particularly Black Americans, whom Japanese propaganda had portrayed as America's own prisoners, might simply be decent human beings acting on conscience rather than calculation. That night, Tanaka confronted Robinson through Yamamoto. "Why do you do this? We're your enemies. We killed your soldiers." Robinson studied him for a long moment before responding. "Yes, you did, and American soldiers killed yours. But the war is over. You're not soldiers anymore. You're men who need care. That's all that matters now." "You don't hate us?" Tanaka asked, genuinely confused. "Hate is exhausting," Robinson replied. "Mercy takes less energy, and it might actually change something." Tanaka returned to his barracks with those words echoing in his mind. That night, several prisoners couldn't sleep. They lay in darkness on clean beds with full stomachs, trying to reconcile their experience with their expectations. The psychological foundation of their worldview was beginning to crumble, and they didn't yet know if they wanted to rebuild it or cling to the familiar ruins of their old beliefs. September 1st, 1945, 6 o'clock in the morning. The ritual began when Robinson rang the brass bell outside the mess hall, its clear tone carrying across the compound in the cool dawn air. The sound meant the same thing it had meant every morning for 9 days. Breakfast was ready, and every prisoner would be fed with dignity. What had started as simple necessity had evolved into something more significant. The 3 daily meals had become a ceremony of transformation. By the second week of September, Camp 7 held 112 Japanese prisoners, 25 additional men having arrived from other holding facilities. Each one underwent the same shock that the original group had experienced. They arrived expecting cruelty and encountered Charlie Robinson's 3 times daily demonstration that their enemies were capable of humanity. The mess hall routine had developed its own rhythm. Robinson arrived at 5 each morning to help prepare food alongside 2 cooks, Privates James Wilson and Robert Lee, both black soldiers from Georgia who'd adopted Robinson's approach without question. By 6, the serving line was ready. By 6:15, the first prisoners filed in. And by 7, 112 men had been fed, thanked, and sent back to their barracks with full stomachs. Lieutenant William Hayes, a white officer from Boston who served as administrative supervisor, filed weekly reports to division headquarters. His September 7th report, now preserved in military archives, noted something remarkable. The Japanese prisoners under Sergeant Robinson's care display none of the resistance or hostility observed at other Pacific facilities. 0 escape attempts, 0 violence. Several have volunteered for labor details beyond their requirements. Request clarification on whether current protocols should be standardized across theater. The transformation was measurable in concrete terms. Average prisoner weight had increased by 12 pounds. Infection rates had dropped to nearly 0. 3 prisoners with untreated combat wounds had undergone successful surgeries. But the deeper change couldn't be quantified in medical records or supply requisitions. It lived in the way prisoners had started making eye contact with guards, in the way they'd begun learning English phrases beyond military necessities, in the quiet conversations that happened during meals, prisoner to prisoner, about the gap between what they'd been taught and what they were experiencing. During lunch on September 8th, Robinson instituted a new practice. As he served each prisoner, he learned to say their name. Not their rank or prisoner number, but their actual name. Private First Class Thomas Green, a white soldier from Ohio assigned to guard duty, observed the interaction and recorded it in a letter home that his family later donated to the Veterans History Project. Sergeant Robinson has memorized all 112 names. He greets each Jap by name as they come through the line. I saw one of them, a tough-looking sergeant who never speaks, actually smile when Robinson said his name correctly. It's the damnedest thing I've ever witnessed. These men were trying to kill us 6 weeks ago, and now they're smiling because a mess sergeant remembers their names. The prisoner Green mentioned was Tanaka. And he had indeed smiled, an involuntary reaction that filled him with shame the moment it happened. He'd smiled at the enemy. Worse, he'd felt gratitude toward the enemy. The internal conflict was becoming unbearable. That afternoon, Tanaka requested a meeting with Robinson through Yamamoto. They sat in the shade of a palm tree outside the administrative building. An unlikely pair. A Japanese sergeant who'd spent 4 years fighting Americans, and a black American sergeant who fed them 3 times daily. "This is strategy," Tanaka said, not quite making it a question. "You feed us well to make us compliant. You learn our names to gather intelligence. You show mercy to extract cooperation." Robinson shook his head slowly. "I feed you because you're hungry. I learn your names because you're human beings. I show mercy because somebody has to stop the cycle." "What cycle?" Tanaka asked. "Cruelty answered with cruelty. Violence answered with violence. Hatred answered with hatred. That cycle doesn't end until someone chooses to break it. 3 times a day, I'm trying to break it." Tanaka was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We were taught that Americans, especially black Americans, were inferior, that they were weak and undisciplined, that they would torture prisoners because they themselves were treated as less than human in their own country." "And now?" Robinson asked. "Now I don't know what to believe," Tanaka admitted. "You've shown us more humanity than our own officers did. You've fed us better than our own army did. You've treated our wounds with more care than our own medics did. Everything we were taught was wrong. If that's wrong, what else is wrong? If you're not monsters, are we the monsters?" Robinson let the question hang in the humid air. He understood that Tanaka wasn't looking for an answer. He was voicing the cognitive dissonance that every prisoner in Camp 7 was experiencing. The psychological transformation wasn't comfortable. It required them to dismantle their entire worldview and rebuild it from scratch. "Come to dinner tonight," Robinson said finally. "Same as always. Good food, clean water, your name spoken with respect. 3 times a day we're all human beings together. Everything else is just noise. September 14th, 1945, 9:30 at night. Tanaka lay awake in his bunk, listening to the sound of his men sleeping. In 2 weeks, everything he'd built his life around had collapsed. Not through violence or interrogation, but through the steady accumulation of small kindnesses delivered 3 times daily by a man he'd been trained to despise. The cognitive dissonance had evolved from uncomfortable to unbearable, and tonight it reached a crisis point. During that morning's breakfast, Robinson had noticed Private Sato shivering despite the tropical heat. Within an hour, Dr. Chen had diagnosed pneumonia, likely contracted from malnutrition-weakened immunity. Robinson had personally moved Sato to the medical barracks, adjusted his meal plan to include extra protein, and checked on him 3 times throughout the day. Tanaka had watched the entire sequence with growing distress. This wasn't strategy. This was genuine concern for a former enemy's welfare. At lunch, Corporal Yamada, whose infected leg wound had healed under American medical care, had approached Robinson with a request translated by Yamamoto. He wanted to write a letter to his mother in Osaka, to tell her he was alive and well treated. Robinson not only arranged for paper and pencil, but spent 20 minutes helping Yamada compose the letter in simple Japanese, using a phrase book he'd been studying in his spare time. The International Red Cross would eventually deliver 17 such letters from Camp 7 prisoners to their families in Japan, each one describing treatment that contradicted every expectation. But dinner had broken something fundamental in Tanaka's resistance. A new prisoner had arrived that afternoon, a lieutenant named Kenji Hayashi who'd been captured in the Philippines. Hayashi was defiant, refusing food, spitting at guards, shouting propaganda about Japanese superiority and American degeneracy. Tanaka recognized his own attitude from 2 weeks earlier. He watched Robinson's response with something approaching dread. Robinson didn't retaliate. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed Hayashi's food tray on a table and said, through Yamamoto, "It'll be here when you're ready to eat. No one will force you, but you're hurting yourself, not us." Then Robinson had done something remarkable. He'd sat down across from Hayashi and eaten his own dinner in silence, occasionally glancing at the defiant lieutenant with an expression that somehow communicated both patience and sadness. After 20 minutes, Hayashi had started eating, tears running down his face as he chewed rice that tasted better than anything he'd eaten in months. Tanaka had watched the entire interaction and realized he was witnessing his own transformation replayed with a new actor. In the darkness of the barracks, Tanaka finally confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. The Americans weren't monsters. Japanese propaganda had been built on lies. The men he'd been taught were inferior, had demonstrated superior character. And he, Sergeant Ishiro Tanaka, veteran of Guadalcanal and Okinawa, holder of medals for bravery, had spent 4 years fighting for beliefs that crumbled under the weight of a black American sergeant's 3 daily acts of kindness. The shame was overwhelming. How many Americans had he killed, believing they were subhuman aggressors? How many of his own men had he sent to die for lies? What did it mean about his entire life if the foundation of his worldview was fiction? The psychological weight of these questions had been building for 2 weeks. Tonight, they demanded answers he couldn't provide. Private Matsuda, sleeping in the bunk above Tanaka, later recalled in testimony, "I heard the sergeant crying, not loud but steady, like something inside him had finally broken." In Japanese military culture, such displays were unacceptable. But we all knew what he was feeling because we were feeling it too. The man we'd followed into battle, who'd embodied everything we believed about Japanese warrior spirit, was weeping because an American had shown him kindness. The next morning, Tanaka approached Robinson before breakfast. His face was drawn, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Yamamoto translated as Tanaka spoke, his voice barely steady. "I need to understand. You're treated as inferior in your own country. We were taught this. Why do you treat us with such respect when your own people don't respect you?" Robinson was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully. When he spoke, his words would be remembered and repeated by prisoners for decades afterward. "Yes, Black Americans face prejudice at home. Yes, we're treated unjustly. But that doesn't mean I should treat you unjustly. 2 wrongs don't make a right. My grandmother used to say that mercy is the only thing that multiplies when you give it away. The more mercy I show, the more mercy exists in the world. Maybe it'll come back to me someday, maybe it won't. But it'll exist, and that matters." He paused, then added, "Besides, I've learned something feeding you 3 times a day for 2 weeks. You're not really different from me. You were told lies about Americans. I was told lies about what black men could achieve. You fought for your country. I fought for mine. The difference is, the war gave me a chance to prove my worth to people who doubted it. The war took that chance from you and left you with nothing but broken beliefs. The least I can do is feed you while you figure out what to believe instead." Tanaka bowed deeply, a gesture of profound respect that would have been unthinkable 3 weeks earlier. When he straightened, Robinson saw something in the Japanese sergeant's face that hadn't been there before. Not just acceptance of defeat, but the beginning of understanding. The transformation was nearly complete. 3 times a day, delivered with consistency and compassion, Robinson's simple act of serving food had accomplished what military force never could. It had changed minds by touching hearts. The breakfast bell rang. 113 prisoners filed into the mess hall. Robinson stood at his post, ready to serve. The ritual continued, 3 times daily, breaking cycles and building bridges 1 meal at a time. September 21st, 1945. 2:15 in the morning. The typhoon hit Camp 7 without warning, its winds screaming across the compound at 80 miles per hour. Rain fell in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to 0. In Barracks C, Sergeant Tanaka woke to the sound of splintering wood and men shouting in panic. The storm had torn a section of roof away, exposing 30 prisoners to the full fury of the Pacific weather. Lightning illuminated the chaos in stark flashes. Men scrambled for cover as rain poured through the opening. Then Tanaka heard a scream that cut through the wind. Private Katsuro Takahashi, attempting to secure loose equipment, had been struck by a falling beam. He lay pinned beneath timber and twisted metal, blood mixing with rainwater on the wooden floor. What happened in the next 20 minutes would complete Tanaka's transformation from enemy soldier to something else entirely. Through the storm, a figure appeared in the barracks doorway. Charlie Robinson, soaked to the skin, carrying a medical kit and a flashlight. He'd been making emergency rounds when the typhoon struck, checking on prisoners rather than seeking his own shelter. Robinson assessed the situation in seconds. He handed the flashlight to Tanaka without hesitation, trusting a former enemy in a moment of crisis. Together, they lifted the beam off Takahashi. The young soldier's left arm was badly broken, bone visible through torn flesh. Robinson worked quickly, applying a tourniquet and pressure bandages while wind howled through the damaged roof above them. "We need to get him to the medical barracks," Robinson shouted over the storm. He lifted Takahashi with help from Tanaka and 2 other prisoners. The group moved through the typhoon, Robinson leading them across the compound to Dr. Chen's facility. Wind threatened to knock them down with every step. Rain blinded them, but Robinson never faltered, his arms supporting most of Takahashi's weight. In the medical barracks, Dr. Chen and Robinson worked for 3 hours to save Takahashi's arm. Tanaka watched from the doorway, unable to leave. He observed Robinson's hands, steady despite exhaustion, as they assisted with the surgery. He heard Robinson's voice, calm and encouraging, as he spoke to Takahashi in broken Japanese. He witnessed an American sergeant treat a Japanese prisoner with the same urgency and care he would show for his own brother. Corporal Yamada, whose own leg had been saved by American medical care, stood beside Tanaka during the operation. Years later, in a 1972 interview, Yamada recalled that moment. Sergeant Tanaka was weeping silently as we watched, not from sadness, but from the complete destruction of everything he'd believed. Here was a black American man, someone we'd been taught was less than human, risking his life in a typhoon to save a Japanese soldier. The contradiction was so total that belief systems simply collapsed. By dawn, the storm had passed. Takahashi was stable, his arms set and bandaged. Robinson had been awake for 32 hours straight. His uniform was still soaked, his face drawn with exhaustion. But before seeking rest, he made his rounds to check on every prisoner, ensuring the storm had caused no other casualties. Tanaka followed him on those rounds, helping without being asked. At one point, as they inspected damage to Barracks D, Tanaka spoke in his limited English. "Why you help us? We enemy." Robinson paused, considering his words carefully. When he responded, his answer would be recorded in multiple prisoner testimonies and military reports. "In a storm, there are no enemies. Only people who need help. The war taught us to hate. Peace requires us to remember we're all human. Last night you helped me save Takahashi. You could have stayed in your bunk. You didn't. Maybe we're learning the same lesson." That afternoon, despite his exhaustion, Robinson rang the bell for lunch at the usual time. The mess hall roof had been damaged, but he'd rigged tarps to keep rain off the serving area. Every prisoner received their meal. The ritual continued unbroken. 3 times a day, rain or shine, peace or storm, Robinson demonstrated that mercy was not conditional on convenience. Private Matsuda wrote in his diary that evening, an entry later published in a Japanese historical journal. "Today I saw the sergeant cry as he watched the American save Takahashi-san. Tonight I saw the sergeant help serve our dinner, working alongside Robinson-san as if they were comrades. Something has broken in all of us. The propaganda was lies. These Americans, especially the black sergeant, possess more honor than we were taught was possible. We are not worthy of such kindness, yet it is given freely. This is true strength. September 28, 1945, 7 o'clock in the evening. Sergeant Tanaka sat alone in the compound's recreation area, a space Robinson had organized with donated books and writing materials. Around him, prisoners played cards or wrote letters home. The normalcy felt surreal. A month earlier, he'd been fighting for his life on Okinawa. Now he was reading an American magazine in a prison camp, where guards said good morning and the food arrived 3 times daily without fail. The internal conflict had become a physical sensation, a tightness in his chest that never eased. During the day, he helped with camp maintenance alongside other prisoners. They repaired storm damage, tended a small vegetable garden Robinson had started, and assisted with meal preparation. The work was voluntary. No one forced them. Yet nearly every prisoner participated, driven by something they couldn't quite name. Gratitude? Guilt? The simple human need to contribute rather than merely consume. But at night, alone with his thoughts, Tanaka wrestled with questions that had no comfortable answers. How many Americans had he killed believing they were monsters? What did those deaths mean now that he knew his beliefs were built on lies? Could a man who'd spent 4 years as an instrument of propaganda-fueled hatred ever deserve the mercy he was receiving? Robinson faced his own crisis during this period, though he revealed it to few people. In a letter to his wife Sarah, dated September 26th and preserved in the Robinson family archives, he wrote with unusual candor, "I feed these men 3 times a day and see them as human beings. But at night, I remember my cousin James, killed at Pearl Harbor. I remember buddies who died in the Philippines. Some days the mercy comes easy. Other days it costs everything I have. I keep doing it because I believe it's right. But believing something is right doesn't always make it feel right." The tension in camp reflected these private struggles. Some American guards resented Robinson's approach. Why treat the enemy with such care? Why waste resources on men who'd tried to kill Americans? Private Daniel McCarthy from Brooklyn voiced these concerns openly during a September 29th Guard meeting, his comments recorded in Lieutenant Hayes's administrative log. "These Japs killed our guys. Now we're feeding them better than we eat, teaching them English, giving them medical care. Where's the justice in that? They should be breaking rocks, not playing cards and reading magazines." Robinson's response was documented in the same log. "Justice isn't about revenge. It's about doing what's right regardless of what was done to us. We beat them in battle. Now we're showing them that American values aren't just propaganda. We actually believe in human dignity. That's worth more than making them break rocks." But the philosophical argument didn't ease the emotional weight. Robinson had lost friends to Japanese soldiers. Some of the prisoners in his care had likely killed Americans. The mathematics of war created impossible equations. How did mercy balance against memory? How did compassion coexist with grief? During this period, Tanaka and Robinson began having longer conversations through Yamamoto's translation. They discovered uncomfortable commonalities. Both had been farmers before the war, working land their families had tended for generations. Both had younger siblings they'd tried to protect from hardship. Both had believed they were fighting for something worth dying for, only to discover war was more complex than propaganda suggested. On October 2nd, after evening meal service, Tanaka asked Robinson a question that had been building for days. "You are a black man in America. You face hatred in your own country. Why you show mercy to us when you receive no mercy yourself?" Robinson's answer, translated by Yamamoto and recorded in Tanaka's diary, revealed the depth of his struggle. My people have been treated unjustly for centuries. I know what it feels like to be seen as less than human. That experience gave me two choices. I could let it make me cruel, use my power over you to get revenge for my own pain. Or I could let it make me compassionate, use my power to break the cycle. Some days the first choice seems easier, but the second choice is the only one that leads anywhere worth going. He paused, then added something that would be quoted in multiple historical accounts. Besides, showing you mercy isn't really about you. It's about who I want to be. I can't control how others treat me, but I can control how I treat others. 3 times a day, I choose mercy. That choice defines me more than any choice made by people who hate me. The conversation ended in silence. Both men sat with their contradictions. Robinson carried the weight of justified anger tempered by chosen compassion. Tanaka carried the weight of shattered beliefs being rebuilt from fragments. Between them lay a growing understanding that transformation was painful for everyone involved. That night, neither man slept well. In separate barracks, they lay awake wrestling with the same fundamental question. How do you move forward when the past weighs 1,000 pounds? The answer, they were learning, wasn't found in a single revelation, but in daily choices. 3 times a day, they chose to sit together in the mess hall. 3 times a day, they chose to see each other's humanity. The accumulation of those choices, repeated steadily despite doubt and pain, was slowly building something that looked like peace. October 7th, 1945. 9 o'clock in the morning. The vegetable garden behind the mess hall had become an unlikely common ground between former enemies. Robinson had started it in early September, reasoning that fresh vegetables would supplement canned rations and give prisoners purposeful work. What he hadn't anticipated was how dirt and seeds would create space for conversations that formal interrogations never could have produced. Tanaka worked alongside Robinson that morning, both men on their knees planting rows of lettuce and radishes. The work was simple and repetitive, creating a comfortable silence that occasionally broke into dialogue. Private Thomas Green, the guard from Ohio, observed from his post, and later wrote to his family about what he witnessed. The Jap sergeant and Sergeant Robinson work together like they've been farming partners for years. They don't talk much, but when they do, it's real talk. Not war talk. Just 2 men sharing the kind of things farmers share. Robinson had brought photographs from home, kept in a waterproof pouch he carried in his uniform pocket. As they worked, he showed them to Tanaka. A picture of his wife Sarah standing in front of their small house in Georgia. His 2 daughters, aged 7 and 9, dressed in Sunday clothes. His father, an elderly man with weathered hands, standing beside a cotton field. "This is my family," Robinson said through Yamamoto, who'd become a constant presence during these working sessions. "My father farmed cotton for 40 years, never owned the land, just worked it. He wanted better for me. Thought the army might be a path forward." Tanaka studied the photographs with intensity that surprised Robinson. When he spoke, his voice carried emotion that translation couldn't fully capture. "Your father's hands? They look like my father's hands. Same from working soil." He produced his own photographs, creased and water-stained from months of combat and captivity. His family standing before a rice paddy in rural Japan. His mother, his father, 2 younger sisters, and a brother barely 14 years old. The house behind them was small, the poverty visible even in the faded image. "My father also farmer," Tanaka said, his English improving daily. "Also want better for sons. Think military bring honor and security. Now I am prisoner, and he has no sons to help with harvest." The parallel was undeniable and uncomfortable. Both men had been farmers' sons seeking something beyond the fields their fathers worked. Both had found themselves in uniform, fighting wars that seemed clear-cut from a distance, but became complicated up close. Both had families waiting at home, wondering if they'd return. Robinson asked about the brother, and Tanaka's face darkened. He joined military last year, 14 years old. I not know if he alive. War take everyone in the end. The conversation shifted to farming techniques, a safer topic that nonetheless revealed shared knowledge. Tanaka described the careful management of water in rice paddies. Robinson explained the backbreaking work of cotton harvest. Both men had knowledge passed down through generations, practical wisdom about soil and weather and the patience required to coax life from earth. Corporal Yamada, working nearby with other prisoners on a separate garden plot, overheard much of this exchange. In his 1978 memoir, he reflected on its significance. We had been taught that Americans were alien creatures, fundamentally different from us. But listening to Tanaka-san and Robinson-san discuss farming, I realized we shared more than separated us. Both knew the feeling of dirt under fingernails. Both understood the hope of planting and the satisfaction of harvest. Both had left the land to serve countries that promised them honor, but delivered hardship. The propaganda collapsed under the weight of these simple truths. That afternoon, Robinson shared something more personal. He spoke about the prejudice he faced in his own army, how black soldiers were often given support roles rather than combat positions, how they fought for a country that denied them basic rights at home. Tanaka listened with growing understanding, recognizing in Robinson's experience a different but parallel kind of oppression. "You fight for country that not respect you?" Tanaka asked, genuinely confused. "Why?" Robinson's answer, preserved in multiple accounts, revealed the complexity of his position. "Because I love what America promises to be, even when it fails to deliver. Because my children deserve better than what I got. Because sometimes you fight not for what is, but for what could be. And maybe by serving honorably, by showing mercy even to enemies, I prove to people who doubt me that I deserve respect." He paused, then added, "3 times a day, I serve you food. 3 times a day, some guards wonder why a black man treats Japanese prisoners with dignity. Every meal is me saying that human worth isn't determined by race or nationality. It's inherent. If I can see your humanity despite the war, maybe others can learn to see mine despite my skin color." The admission hung in the humid air. Tanaka was quiet for a long moment, then spoke words that would mark another turning point. "You are most honorable man I have met. More honorable than many Japanese officers I served under. You teach me that honor is not about following orders or winning battles. Honor is how you treat others when you have power over them." By evening, the garden rows were completed. Robinson and Tanaka stood back to survey their work, hands dirty, backs aching, a shared sense of accomplishment between them. The vegetables would take weeks to mature. But something else had already grown in that space between planting and harvest. Something that looked like friendship between men who'd been enemies, built on dirt and photographs and honest conversation about the weight they both carried. October 13th, 1945. 6:30 in the evening. The sun was setting over Camp 7, painting the Pacific sky in shades of orange and red. Tanaka found Robinson sitting alone outside the mess hall, cleaning the serving utensils in preparation for tomorrow's breakfast. The ritual never stopped. 3 times daily, Robinson prepared to feed 113 men who'd been his enemies. The consistency had become something the entire camp depended on, a rhythm that marked time and promised continuity in an uncertain world. Tanaka had been preparing for this conversation for 3 days. The weight of it pressed on his chest, making breathing difficult. But silence had become more unbearable than confession. He sat beside Robinson without invitation, and the American sergeant acknowledged his presence with a simple nod. "I need to tell you something," Tanaka said in English. then switched to Japanese when the words became too complex for his limited vocabulary. Yamamoto, always nearby during important moments, translated. I have been thinking about the men I killed in this war, about the hatred I carried, about the beliefs I used to justify violence. Robinson continued cleaning utensils, his hands steady. He didn't interrupt or prompt. He simply listened, giving Tanaka the space to speak. I was taught from childhood that Japanese were superior, Tanaka continued, his voice barely above a whisper. That other races were inferior, that Americans were weak, corrupted, especially black Americans. We were told you had no honor, no courage, no humanity. I believed these lies completely. I never questioned them. The admission came faster now, words pouring out after weeks of internal pressure. I killed men believing they were less than human. I led soldiers into battles fighting for emperor and homeland, never asking if our cause was just. I accepted propaganda as truth and righteousness, as whatever my superiors commanded. I was a fool. Worse, I was a willing fool. Tears ran down Tanaka's face, unwiped. In Japanese military culture, such displays were shameful, but shame had evolved from something to hide into something to confess. Then I came here, and you fed me. 3 times a day, you fed me. You, a black American man I'd been taught was inferior, showed me more humanity than my own officers ever did. You treated wounds, learned names, offered dignity. Everything I believed was exposed as lies. Robinson set down the utensil he'd been cleaning and turned to face Tanaka fully. His expression held no judgment, no satisfaction at vindication, only careful attention to another human being's pain. Now I don't know who I am, Tanaka said. If my beliefs were wrong, what does that make me? If I killed men for lies, what does that make those deaths? If you are honorable and I called you inferior, what does that make my honor? I am ashamed of what I believed. I am ashamed of what I did. But I don't know how to carry this shame forward. The confession complete, Tanaka sat in silence, waiting for Robinson's response. When it came, the words were carefully chosen, translated precisely by Yamamoto, and later recorded in multiple accounts by witnesses who'd gathered nearby. Shame means you've grown, Robinson said. Only people capable of change feel ashamed of who they were. The man who killed for propaganda isn't the same man sitting beside me now. You've been transformed by truth. That transformation doesn't erase the past, but it changes what the past means. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I've been angry at Japanese soldiers. I've lost friends to your military. For a while, I wanted revenge. But anger and revenge don't heal anything. They just create more pain. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen. It means acknowledging the past while choosing a different future. Robinson's next words would be quoted in historical texts and academic studies for decades. You asked what to do with your shame. Here's what I've learned from my own people's experience. Black Americans have carried shame that wasn't ours, imposed by those who called us inferior. We learned that shame imposed from outside is false, but shame that grows from within, from recognizing our own wrongs, that shame can be transformed into wisdom. You can't change what you did, but you can change what you do from here forward. He gestured towards the mess hall. 3 times a day, I feed you, not because you deserve it based on past actions, but because you're human beings who need to eat. That's the lesson. People aren't defined by their worst moments. They're defined by what they choose when given the chance to choose differently. You've been given that chance. The question isn't whether you deserve it. The question is what you'll do with it. Tanaka wiped his face, composing himself. What should I do with it? Go home when this ends, Robinson said simply. Tell people what you learned. Teach them that hatred is built on lies. Show them that former enemies can become friends when they see each other's humanity. 3 times a day, I've shown you mercy. You can spend the rest of your life showing mercy to others. That's how transformation spreads. The conversation ended as the sun set completely. In the darkness, two men sat side by side. One had confessed his shame. The other had offered a path forward. Neither believed the path would be easy, but both understood that transformation required walking it regardless of difficulty. 3 times a day, small choices accumulated into large changes. This was just one more choice in a series that was rebuilding 2 men from the ruins of war. October 20th, 1945. 10 o'clock in the morning. Lieutenant William Carter arrived at Camp 7 with orders, regulations, and a firm belief that Sergeant Robinson's approach to prisoner management was dangerously soft. Carter was regular Army, a career officer from Virginia who'd spent the war in administrative positions stateside. He brought with him the traditional military view that prisoners were enemies, deserving minimal consideration beyond Geneva Convention requirements. His first inspection of the camp produced a report that would create the most serious crisis Robinson had faced since the prisoners' arrival. Carter's assessment, filed with division headquarters and later preserved in military archives, was scathing. Prisoners fraternizing with guards, excessive food rations, voluntary work details creating appearance of cooperation rather than subordination, medical care exceeding minimum standards. Camp operated more like rehabilitation facility than detention center. Recommend immediate implementation of standard protocols. That afternoon, Carter called a meeting with all American personnel. Robinson attended with growing dread, sensing that the 3 times daily ritual that had transformed Camp 7 was under threat. Carter's speech was clear and uncompromising. Gentlemen, we are not running a hotel. These are enemy prisoners of war. They attempted to kill American soldiers. Some of your friends, your brothers, died fighting these men. Yet I arrived to find them playing cards, writing letters, working gardens, eating food that exceeds their entitlement. This ends immediately. Effective tomorrow, prisoners will receive minimum rations. Recreation materials will be removed. Voluntary work details will cease. We will operate by the book, nothing more. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Several guards nodded agreement. Private McCarthy from Brooklyn spoke up immediately. About time, sir. Some of us been saying this for weeks. These Japs are getting treated better than they deserve. But others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Lieutenant Hayes, who'd overseen operations under Robinson's approach, looked troubled. Private Green from Ohio appeared torn, and Robinson, standing at the back of the room, felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear. Determination. Permission to speak, sir, Robinson said quietly. Carter nodded, his expression suggesting he expected subordinate compliance after being allowed to voice concerns. With respect, sir, minimum treatment will undo 3 months of progress. These men arrived expecting cruelty. We've shown them mercy instead. That mercy has created a model camp. 0 escape attempts, 0 violence, complete cooperation. We've transformed enemy soldiers into men who might return to Japan as friends of America. Reducing them to minimum standards will confirm every piece of propaganda they were taught about us. Carter's face hardened. That's not our mission, Sergeant. Our mission is to detain enemy prisoners securely until repatriation. We're not in the friendship business. We're in the winning the war business. The war is over, sir, Robinson replied. Now we're in the building the peace business. Every prisoner we send home with respect for American values is a seed of peace planted in Japan. Every prisoner we send home bitter and resentful is a seed of future conflict. Which seeds do we want to plant? The argument that followed was documented in multiple accounts. Carter insisted on regulations. Robinson defended transformation. Hayes cautiously supported Robinson's position with evidence. McCarthy demanded tougher treatment. Green admitted conflicted feelings. The debate revealed fault lines in American thinking about how victors should treat the defeated. Finally, Carter played his authority card. Sergeant Robinson, I appreciate your perspective, but I'm the ranking officer. My orders stand. Minimum rations start tomorrow. Dismissed. That evening, Robinson faced the hardest decision of his military career. He could obey orders and watch 3 months of careful work unravel, or he could resist and face military discipline. He walked to the mess hall and began preparing for dinner service, moving through familiar motions while his mind wrestled with impossible choices. Tanaka found him there, recognizing the tension in Robinson's movements. "Something is wrong," he said. It wasn't a question. Through Yamamoto, Robinson explained Carter's orders. As he spoke, other prisoners gathered, drawn by the serious tone. Matsuda, Yamada, Sato, Takahashi, and a dozen others listened as Robinson described how everything would change. The response was immediate and unexpected. Tanaka turned to his fellow prisoners and spoke rapidly in Japanese. A consensus formed quickly. Then Tanaka turned back to Robinson with determination in his eyes. "We will help you," he said simply. "You showed us mercy 3 times every day for 3 months. Now we show you we learned the lesson. Tomorrow we work harder. We cause no problems. We prove that your way succeeds. We will not let the new officer destroy what you built." Robinson started to object, but Matsuda interrupted. "You taught us that mercy changes people. Let us prove you were right. Let us show that Japanese prisoners can become Japanese friends." That night, the prisoners of Camp 7 made a choice that would be studied by military psychologists for decades. Instead of celebrating the possibility of stricter American control being softer than their own military, they chose to defend the compassionate system that had transformed them. They chose loyalty to the man who'd fed them 3 times daily over resentment toward former enemies. The transformation Robinson had worked for was complete. His prisoners had become his allies. October 21st, 1945, 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun hadn't yet risen when every prisoner in Camp 7 assembled voluntarily in the compound yard. They stood in perfect formation without being ordered, without guards forcing compliance. Tanaka stood at the front, with Matsuda, Yamada, and other informal leaders beside him. They waited for Lieutenant Carter's arrival with quiet determination. Carter emerged from his quarters at 5:30 to find this unprecedented sight. 113 Japanese prisoners standing at attention, unified in purpose. Robinson stood off to the side, equally surprised. He hadn't known about this demonstration. The prisoners had organized it themselves overnight, a spontaneous response to defend the mercy they'd received. Through Yamamoto, Tanaka addressed Carter directly. "Lieutenant Carter, sir, we are Japanese prisoners of war. For 3 months, Sergeant Robinson has treated us with dignity. He fed us 3 times daily. He learned our names. He cared for our sick and wounded. He showed us that Americans possess honor." Carter's expression remained stern, but he listened. "You believe we must receive minimum treatment," Tanaka continued. "You believe mercy makes us weak or encourages future enemies. You are wrong, sir. Cruelty we expected. Cruelty would have confirmed everything we were taught about Americans. We would have returned to Japan hating you, but mercy changed us. We arrived as enemies. We will leave as friends." He gestured to the assembled prisoners. "Today we prove Sergeant Robinson's way works. We volunteer to work harder than regulations require. We will repair every building, clean every surface, improve every aspect of this camp. We will show you that mercy creates cooperation, that force never could. We do this not because we must, but because we choose to. Because we learned from the man who fed us 3 times a day that mercy is strength, not weakness." What followed was documented by Lieutenant Hayes in reports that military historians later called unprecedented. The prisoners organized themselves into work details without being asked. They repaired storm damage that had been neglected for weeks. They cleaned barracks until they gleamed. They worked the gardens with renewed energy. They even organized their own recreation time to avoid disrupting camp operations. By noon, Carter was visibly struggling with the situation. His orders assumed prisoners would respond to strictness with sullen compliance. Instead, they'd responded to the threat of strictness with enthusiastic cooperation that made strictness unnecessary. The entire framework of his traditional approach had been undermined by men who'd been transformed by mercy. During lunch, the prisoners insisted on serving themselves to reduce burden on American staff. They maintained perfect order in the mess hall. They thanked Robinson personally, each one speaking his name, demonstrating what 3 months of dignity had created. Carter watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Private Green wrote to his family that evening, his letter now preserved in the Veterans History Project. Today I saw something I never expected to see in this war. Japanese prisoners defending a black American sergeant's right to show them mercy. They worked like demons to prove that kindness works better than cruelty. The new lieutenant looked like he'd been hit with a brick. How do you enforce strictness when prisoners volunteer to exceed every standard? By evening, Carter requested a private meeting with Robinson. They sat in the administrative office, while the sun set. 2 men representing different philosophies of power and control. I don't understand this, Carter admitted. They're prisoners. They should resent us. Why did they defend you? Robinson's answer was simple. Because I fed them 3 times a day, because I treated them like human beings, because I showed them that American values aren't just words. People respond to how they're treated. Treat them like enemies. They remain enemies. Treat them like human beings capable of change, and they change. Carter was silent for a long moment. Your approach contradicts everything I was taught about prisoner management. Yes, sir, it does. But results don't lie. 3 months, 0 problems. Complete transformation. These men will go home and tell everyone they meet that Americans showed them mercy. That's worth more than 1,000 propaganda broadcasts. That's how you win the peace. The lieutenant's decision came the next morning. His memorandum to division headquarters recommended that Camp 7's protocols be maintained without change. Sergeant Robinson's approach has produced measurable success in prisoner cooperation and morale. His methods, while unconventional, demonstrate that mercy can be strategically effective. Recommend his techniques be studied for possible implementation at other facilities. When Robinson learned of Carter's decision, he found the lieutenant alone in his office. Thank you, sir. I know that couldn't have been easy. Carter looked up from his paperwork. Your prisoners taught me something yesterday, Sergeant. They showed me that loyalty can't be forced. It has to be earned. You earned it by feeding them 3 times a day with dignity. They repaid it by proving your approach works. I was wrong to think minimum standards would be sufficient. Sometimes maximum humanity produces better results. That evening, dinner service proceeded as normal. Robinson served food with the same careful attention he'd shown since day 1. But now every prisoner understood the significance of the ritual. 3 times daily, mercy had been offered and received. That mercy had created bonds strong enough that prisoners defended their captor against stricter treatment. The transformation was complete and undeniable. Seeds of peace had been planted, watered 3 times daily with acts of simple human kindness. November 18th, 1946. 7 o'clock in the morning. The transport ship that would carry 113 Japanese prisoners back to their homeland sat anchored in Guam's harbor. After 15 months in American custody, the men of Camp 7 were going home. But the soldiers boarding that vessel bore little resemblance to the defeated, traumatized prisoners who'd arrived in August of 1945. Robinson stood at the dock as prisoners filed past for the last time. He'd served them breakfast 3 hours earlier, maintaining the ritual until the final moment. Now, as each man prepared to leave. They stopped to speak with him through Yamamoto's translation. Some shook his hand. Others bowed deeply. Several wept openly, no longer ashamed of emotions they'd learned to express during their transformation. Tanaka was among the last to board. He carried a small bag containing personal belongings and something more valuable. A letter Robinson had written, addressed to Tanaka's father, explaining that his son had conducted himself with honor during captivity. Also tucked inside was a photograph of Robinson's family and a copy of the mess hall rotation schedule. Physical reminders that 3 times daily for 15 months, an enemy had chosen mercy over revenge. "I don't know how to thank you," Tanaka said in carefully practiced English. His vocabulary had grown significantly during the long months of daily conversation. "You changed everything I believed. You showed me what honor truly means." Robinson's response was characteristically simple. "Go home. Rebuild your country. Treat others with the mercy you received here. That's thanks enough." What neither man fully understood in that moment was the historical ripple effect already beginning. The story of Camp 7 had spread through military channels, studied by psychologists and strategists planning post-war occupation policies. Robinson's approach would influence how American forces managed the occupation of Japan, contributing to a surprisingly peaceful transition from enemies to allies. In 1948, General Douglas MacArthur's staff would cite Camp 7 as evidence that Japanese civilians could respond positively to respectful treatment. The relatively benign occupation that followed, so different from harsh occupation policies in other conflicts, owed something to lessons learned on a small Pacific island where a black sergeant had fed his enemies 3 times daily with dignity. Tanaka returned to Japan and became a teacher in Osaka. For 37 years, he taught history and civics, always including a unit on his time as a prisoner of war. Thousands of Japanese students heard about the black American sergeant who'd shown mercy when vengeance seemed more appropriate. Many of those students would later become business leaders, diplomats, and politicians who built the post-war alliance between America and Japan. Private Matsuda became a restaurant owner in Tokyo. He named his establishment 3 times, serving American-style food and displaying Robinson's photograph prominently. Countless American tourists ate there over the decades, learning the story of how mercy had transformed enemies into friends. Corporal Yamada, whose leg had been saved by American medical care, became a doctor. He spent his career treating all patients with equal dignity, regardless of background. In a 1989 interview, shortly before his death, he reflected on Robinson's influence. "He taught us that humanity transcends nationality, that mercy is strength, not weakness, that small daily acts of kindness can change the world. I tried to live those lessons in my medical practice. Every patient I treated with respect was my way of honoring what Sergeant Robinson showed us." Robinson returned to Georgia after the war. He faced the same racial prejudice he'd known before enlistment. But something had changed inside him. He'd proven to himself, if not to all of America, that character transcended skin color. He worked as a teacher, raised his family, and rarely spoke publicly about his time at Camp 7. When asked about it by his grandchildren years later, he gave a simple answer. "I fed them 3 times a day, that's all. You'd be surprised what ordinary kindness can accomplish." The full significance of Camp 7 became clear decades later. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of war's end, survivors from Camp 7 returned to Guam for a reunion. 15 former prisoners made the journey, including Tanaka, now 81 years old. They dedicated a memorial plaque at the former campsite. The inscription read simply, "Here, mercy was served 3 times daily. Here, enemies became friends. Here, peace began." Robinson had died in 1988, but his widow Sarah attended the ceremony. She accepted thanks from men who credited her husband with teaching them that hatred could be overcome. She heard testimonies from prisoners who'd spent 50 years spreading the message of compassion they'd learned. She watched as former enemies wept for the man who'd fed them with dignity. The transformation that began with a ladle of water on a hot August day in 1945 had rippled across decades. It influenced occupation policies, shaped individual lives, and contributed to one of history's most remarkable transformations, from bitter enemies to close allies. The mathematics of mercy proved more powerful than the mathematics of revenge. 3 times a day, for 15 months, Charlie Robinson had made a choice. He chose to see humanity in enemies. He chose to offer dignity to the defeated. He chose mercy when anger seemed justified. Those choices, repeated thousands of times in a forgotten corner of the Pacific, helped change the course of history. Not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through the steady accumulation of small kindnesses served with every meal. The lesson endures. Mercy multiplies when given away. Compassion transforms when offered consistently. And sometimes, the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but at serving lines where former enemies break bread together. 3 times a day, peace is possible. 3 times a day, change begins. 3 times a day, mercy wins. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.